On the 23rd of September 1943, a freight train stopped at a siding surrounded by pine trees in eastern Poland. Inside were nearly 2,000 people, most of them Jews from the Minsk ghetto, along with a group of Soviet prisoners of war captured months earlier at the front. Among them was a 34-year-old Red Army lieutenant, thin, his hands cracked after 2 years in captivity. His name was Alexander Pechersky. He had been captured in October 1941 during the Battle of Moscow. Since then, he had passed through several prisoner of war camps, contracted typhus, and managed to conceal the illness for 7 months because anyone who revealed it was shot, and attempted to escape once, unsuccessfully, before ending up in a labor camp from which he was sent that September towards Sobibór. When the wagon doors opened, an SS officer walked along the platform, asking people their trades: carpenter, tailor, shoemaker. Anyone who answered with a useful occupation had a chance, tiny but real, of not being sent directly to the showers that were not showers. Pechersky had never worked with wood in his life. He said he was a carpenter anyway. The officer wrote his name on a list and separated him from the group with 79 other men. Of the nearly 2,000 people who stepped down that morning, barely 80 men were set aside because of the trades they claimed. The rest, including women, children, and elderly people who had nothing to offer except their presence, were led along a path bordered by barbed wire toward a brick building camouflaged with pine branches. No one explained exactly where they were going, only that they first had to undergo disinfection. None of them ever came out. Pechersky, the lie still fresh in his mouth, was taken in the opposite direction, toward the barracks where the camp kept alive those prisoners whose labor it found useful. He did not know it yet, but he had just entered the Sobibór extermination camp with fewer than 3 weeks of useful life remaining, according to the calculation applied there to every labor prisoner. And in those 3 weeks, he would organize the deadliest escape ever carried out against a Nazi killing center. Sobibór did not operate like a concentration camp or a labor camp. It functioned as a single-purpose installation, designed so that the people who entered from the platform would never leave alive, except for the small group needed to keep the machinery running. At any given time, that group numbered between 400 and 600 prisoners, replaced week after week as they died from exhaustion, beatings, or arbitrary execution. Without yet realizing it, Pechersky had just become one of them. The decision to build a place like Sobibór had been made almost 2 years earlier, in January 1942, during a meeting that lasted less than 2 hours in a villa beside a lake outside Berlin. 15 officials sat down at once to coordinate something that had already been taking place since the previous summer: the systematic murder of the Jews of Europe. The meeting did not invent extermination. The Einsatzgruppen had already spent months shooting entire communities on the Eastern Front. What Wannsee did was bureaucratize it, divide responsibilities among ministries, and turn genocide into a problem of railway logistics. In the general government of occupied Poland, the task of implementing that policy fell to one man in particular: Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader in Lublin. Globoknik did not receive vague instructions. He received a precise assignment: build the infrastructure required to kill, not to imprison, not to exploit labor, but to kill, and do it quickly, quietly, and without leaving an administrative trail that could later be used against him. The program was called Action Reinhard, in honor of Reinhard Heydrich, assassinated months earlier by the Czech resistance. Globoknik chose 3 sites: Bełżec, Treblinka, and Sobibór. All 3 shared the same strategic advantages. They stood beside secondary railway lines, far from major cities, surrounded by enough forest to conceal what happened inside. Together, these 3 camps would be responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people, a figure that surpassed Auschwitz-Birkenau in their specific function as centers of immediate extermination. And yet, in collective memory, Auschwitz occupies a place that Sobibór, Bełżec, and Treblinka never achieved. The reason has nothing to do with the scale of the crime, but with what remained standing after it had been committed. Auschwitz physically survived the war and could be photographed, documented, and visited. The Action Reinhard camps were destroyed before that could happen, and that deliberate destruction largely explains why their names remain far less familiar today than the scale of their crimes should warrant. Sobibór was the second of the 3 to be built. Construction began in early 1942 under the supervision of Richard Tomala, an SS engineer who had already taken part in building Belzec and who applied the same basic layout at Sobibór, modified after the first months of operation at the earlier camp. Tomala was not an ideologue given to speeches. Above all, he was a builder. He reviewed plans, calculated capacities, and adjusted dimensions according to what had failed in the previous attempt. The chosen site lay near the village of Sobibór, in the Lublin district, on the eastern bank of a small river. The area was sparsely populated. A railway spur ran directly to the location. Tall pine trees covered almost the entire perimeter. From the first day, the design answered a single priority. No one arriving at the platform should be able to guess, even for a second, what was happening only a few meters away. The camp was divided into zones separated by fences and screens of interwoven branches, so that anyone in one section could not see what was happening in the next. There was a reception area where new arrivals were processed, an area where clothing, luggage, and valuables were confiscated, and a narrow fenced path the SS called the Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven, which led directly to the section known internally as Camp 3. That area remained hidden behind trees and a double fence, invisible from every other point in the camp. The gas chambers stood there, and behind them, the pits. The method did not use Zyklon B pellets, as at Auschwitz. It used carbon monoxide generated by a diesel engine, probably from a captured tank, whose exhaust pipe was connected directly to the sealed chambers through piping installed by a specialist brought from Germany specifically for that task. The engine remained running throughout the entire process, and its maintenance was the responsibility of a single non-commissioned officer who came to know its faults and starting times with the same familiarity a mechanic knows the engine of his own car. Death came between 20 and 30 minutes after the doors were closed, although the suffering began much sooner. The chambers were packed to their physical limit so that those nearest the center died standing, held upright by the bodies around them. The first transports arrived in April 1942 from Jewish communities in the Lublin district itself. Most had been told they were being resettled in the east. That lie was not a secondary detail of the procedure. It was the central mechanism that allowed everything to function without resistance. As long as the victims believed they were only passing through, there would be no panic, and without panic, the process moved faster. The train entered slowly, without sudden braking, with a calculated courtesy containing nothing human and serving an entirely practical function. The wagons had remained sealed for 2, sometimes 3 days. Inside, some people had already died from heat, thirst, or lack of air. Those who stepped onto the platform found a stage set built specifically for them, signs bearing invented station names, a clock, timetables for trains that did not exist, and SS officers who received them with a speech rehearsed so many times that it sounded almost friendly. They had been resettled. They were in a transit camp. They would be assigned to work in the east. First, for reasons of hygiene, they had to shower and surrender their documents and valuables for safekeeping. Above the door of the building where the route ended hung a sign reading Bad und Inhalation, baths and inhalation, painted with the same administrative care as the sign at a real railway station. Inside, there were no water pipes. A small group of prisoners, selected from among the youngest and most presentable, worked on the platform helping unload luggage and directing the new arrivals with reassuring gestures. An additional layer of normality that did not even require words. The script was repeated transport after transport with only minor variations because it worked. The objective was not to convince anyone forever. It was to gain the next 20 minutes without anyone running, without anyone shouting, without the process becoming jammed. Franz Stangl, an Austrian police officer who had previously worked at the Hartheim Euthanasia Center, where people with disabilities were murdered under the Action T4 program, took command of Sobibór during its first months. Stangl understood something decisive. Efficiency depended on preserving the illusion of normality for as long as possible. Upon arrival, men and women were separated, presented as a simple formality. In reality, it was the first irreversible step. Families that had survived years of persecution together were divided in that instant, almost always forever. The women's hair was cut, packed, and sent to Germany for industrial use. Clothing, footwear, and valuables were confiscated, catalogued, and shipped west. Then came the Himmelstrasse, the final stretch, often covered at a run under the shouts and blows of the guards. At the end of the path stood the chambers, described outwardly as showers to preserve the deception, until the final second. They could hold between 150 and 200 people per cycle. Once the doors were sealed, the engine was started. Half an hour later, the chambers were ventilated and the bodies removed, initially by Jewish prisoners forced to perform the task and taken to the mass graves of Camp 3. By the summer of 1942, the pace had become so intense that the original chambers proved insufficient. 3 new, larger chambers were built, capable of processing a considerably greater number of people per cycle. It is estimated that tens of thousands died between May and July of that year alone. There was even an interruption lasting several weeks that summer while the main railway line was repaired. During that period, transports were diverted to Belzec and Treblinka. When the line reopened, Sobibór resumed operations as though nothing had changed. The victims came from across occupied Europe. Most were Polish Jews from the Lublin district, but transports also arrived from Austria, Germany, Slovakia, France, and the Netherlands. An estimated 34,000 Dutch Jews deported from the Westerbork transit camp died at Sobibór, many of them convinced until the end that they were being sent to work. The journey from Westerbork to Sobibór usually lasted 3 days, without sufficient water or adequate ventilation inside wagons sealed from the outside. One statistical detail distinguished Sobibór even within the Nazi extermination system itself. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, which also operated as a killing center, there was a selection on the platform. Those considered fit for work entered the prisoner camp, where they might survive for days, weeks, or months, and some later lived to testify. At Sobibór, that distinction barely existed, except for the small group of Arbeitsjuden needed for the camp's internal operation. For everyone else, the entire process, from stepping off the train to death, lasted between 40 minutes and an hour and a half. There was no intermediate phase of survival. This meant that the mortality rate among those who arrived at Sobibór approached 100%, and that the number of people capable of later describing what happened inside the camp in the first person was minimal by design from the beginning. The German staff never exceeded 20 or 30 men at any one time. Most came from the T4 euthanasia program, men who had already participated in the murder of German and Austrian people with disabilities, and who arrived at Sobibór with exactly the operational experience required. Alongside them, more than 100 Ukrainian guards and men of other Eastern European nationalities, recruited from Soviet prisoner of war camps and trained at a facility called Troniki, carried out much of the physical work, escorting, beating, and shooting along the perimeter. Many had accepted recruitment as the direct alternative to starvation in Soviet prisoner of war camps, where conditions for captured Red Army soldiers were already brutal. Among the German officers, Karl Frenzel stood out as one of the camp's longest-serving guards, whose daily brutality survivors would later describe in detail that remains difficult to read even today. Erich Bauer was nicknamed the gas master by the prisoners because of his direct role in operating the chambers. Johann Niemann, the camp's deputy commandant, had a reputation for cruelty that made him especially feared among the prisoners. Almost all shared the same professional background. They had previously served in the euthanasia program, and when that program was formally suspended in 1941, after protests within Germany itself, led even by a Catholic bishop who denounced the killings from the pulpit, its personnel were not reassigned to ordinary administrative duties. They were sent east, to Poland, because they already knew how to do exactly what Aktion Reinhard required: operate killing installations according to standardized procedures and manage the flow of victims without allowing individual conscience to interfere with operational tempo. They did not arrive at Sobibór to learn a new profession. They came to apply, on a larger scale, one they had already mastered. When Pechersky entered that system in September 1943, the machinery had been operating for 16 months. He and the other Soviet prisoners of war were assigned to cut firewood in a section of the camp supervised by Karl Gomersky. From the first days, other prisoners noticed something different in the way he moved, in how he measured distances without appearing to measure them, in how he watched without giving the impression that he was watching. One afternoon, while Pechersky was splitting wood, Karl Frenzel approached and, with the habitual sarcasm he used toward prisoners, asked whether the work made him hungry. Without looking up from the axe, Pechersky replied that he found the camp rations more than sufficient. Frenzel stared at him for a moment, turned around, and walked away without saying anything else. An officer accustomed to automatic submission did not know how to respond to an answer that was not insolent, but was not fear either. By that same afternoon, the incident was already circulating through the barracks. For many of the Polish prisoners who had spent months searching for someone with the composure needed to lead something beyond daily survival, it was the first sign that the newcomer might be that person. The labor prisoners lived separated according to function and camp section, some in barracks near the unloading platform, others beside the tailoring and shoemaking workshops that supplied the German personnel with custom-made clothing and footwear. The daily ration consisted of watery soup and a tiny piece of bread. Beatings were frequent and largely unpredictable. A guard might strike a prisoner for amusement or for a minor violation of the camp's arbitrary rules, and no one could predict when it would happen or why. At times, prisoners were forced to witness the execution of other inmates, a disciplinary measure intended to remind them constantly of the price of any act of defiance. Karl Frenzel, responsible for the labor camp, was known for turning roll call into a ritual of calculated humiliation, capable of keeping 200 people standing for hours in the rain simply because a button had been sewn on incorrectly. And yet, within those limits, a social world had formed. Information moved in whispers. Networks of mutual support had developed among prisoners who had worked side by side for months. Small acts of sabotage took place that would never appear in any German report. A piece of machinery left slightly misaligned, a tool misplaced, a task performed at a fraction less efficiency than necessary. They were not dramatic gestures. They were the barely perceptible friction of people who had not yet surrendered completely. One of those prisoners was Leon Feldhendler, the son of a rabbi from the Zhokievka region, who had spent almost a year in the camp working in the supply barracks and occasionally at the station. Over time, he had become the informal leader of a group of prisoners who had spent months discussing the possibility of organized resistance without finding a clear way forward. The problem had never been willingness. It was capability. The Germans were armed. The Ukrainian guards were armed. The perimeter was protected by mines and a double fence. Any individual escape attempt risked not only the fugitive's life, but also the collective execution of other prisoners as punishment. Feldhendler and his group had gone so far as to plan an escape tunnel until they discovered that the groundwater level and the exact position of the minefield made the idea impossible. Before that, a small group assigned to the so-called Forest Command, responsible for cutting wood outside the fenced perimeter, had already attempted to escape on their own, taking advantage of moments when surveillance relaxed among the trees. 5 succeeded. The rest were recaptured or disappeared without a trace. And the episode mainly confirmed something Feldhendler already suspected. An individual escape, no matter how well planned, changed nothing for those left behind. What was needed was a simultaneous escape by everyone at once, and for that, determination and knowledge of guard shifts were not enough. Pechersky's arrival changed the calculation. Feldhendler and he met only a few days after the Soviet officer entered the camp. Their conversations took place in stolen fragments of time during work shifts, in brief intervals without direct supervision. There was also a basic obstacle that almost ruined their approach before it began. Pechersky spoke only Russian, while Feldhendler spoke only Polish and Yiddish. They communicated through Schloim Leitman, a carpenter who understood all 3 languages and eventually became the permanent link between the 2 leaders. To meet without arousing suspicion, Feldhendler suggested that Pechersky find a girlfriend inside the camp, a cover tolerated by the guards among labor prisoners. An 18-year-old girl known as Luka agreed to the arrangement. Because she spoke neither Russian nor Yiddish, Pechersky, Feldhendler, and Leitman could talk in front of her without her understanding a word they said. Pechersky brought something Feldhendler's group did not possess: military training and the mentality that came with it. He had commanded men under fire. He understood logistics, synchronization, and how to coordinate an operation involving dozens of people without allowing a single unnecessary word to destroy everything. On October 7, 7 days before the date that would ultimately become decisive, Feldhendler and Pechersky met to play chess in one of the barracks. An improvised board with pieces carved from wood served as cover, allowing them to speak without arousing suspicion while a guard passed nearby every few minutes. They moved pieces almost at random while speaking quietly, without looking at each other, their eyes fixed on the board as though the game mattered. They discussed whether it was possible to dig a tunnel that same night and evacuate the 600 prisoners still in the camp before dawn. They decided there would not be enough time. What they agreed on instead was an alternative requiring synchronization, skill with improvised weapons, a willingness to risk everything, and a considerable amount of luck. They formed a clandestine committee of 8 people, 4 Soviet prisoners of war and 4 men from Feldhendler's group, who met repeatedly to exchange information and refine the plan. Among the prisoners with whom Pechersky eventually coordinated the operation was Yehuda Lerner, a young man who had already made several unsuccessful escape attempts from other camps before arriving at Sobibór. Decades later, Lerner would describe with a frankness that remains disturbing the naturalness with which he accepted his assignment: kill a particular officer, in a particular workshop, at a particular time. There was no prolonged moral hesitation. He had seen too many people die not to recognize in that opportunity something resembling a second life. The urgency intensified in the autumn of 1943 when news spread through the camp's internal networks that Treblinka had closed in August after its own prisoner revolt. Belzec had ceased operating even earlier. If the pattern repeated, and there was reason to believe it would, Sobibór would be next, and when a camp was liquidated, its prisoner labor force was liquidated as well. What had previously been an abstract possibility became a concrete countdown. The plan they developed did not depend on a frontal assault, which would have been impossible without firearms of their own. It depended on precision and silence. Small groups of prisoners would lure SS officers one by one into the camp workshops, using ordinary pretexts, trying on a new coat, collecting a pair of boots, inspecting a newly finished piece of furniture. There they would be killed with improvised tools, axes, and knives, without a gunshot alerting the rest of the camp. Only afterward, during the afternoon roll call, when all the prisoners had gathered, would the signal be given for everyone who could run to rush toward the main gate. The original date was October 13, which also coincided with Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. None of the organizers had chosen it for symbolic reasons. It was simply the day the plan was ready. That afternoon, only minutes before the officers were to begin receiving their summons to the workshops, an unexpected group of SS visitors arrived at the camp. The operation was aborted at the last moment, with the tension of someone who has prepared a weapon and must put it away unused, knowing that every day of delay increases the risk that someone will say too much, that a guard will notice something unusual in a prisoner's behavior, or that the entire plan will be uncovered before it can be carried out. It was rescheduled for the following day, the 14th of October 1943, with one additional advantage. Commandant Reichleitner and 2 other senior officers were away from the camp that afternoon. Their trip had nothing to do with what was about to happen, but it reduced the number of commanders capable of responding quickly by exactly the margin the conspirators needed. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, Johann Niemann, the deputy commandant whose daily cruelty had made him one of the most feared figures in the camp, entered the tailoring workshop to try on a leather coat he had been told had just been finished for him. Alexander Shubayev, one of the Soviet soldiers who had arrived with Pechersky, was waiting inside. Niemann removed his tunic, put on the coat, and looked at his shoulders as a man might judge the effect of a new garment. Shubayev split his skull with an axe, 2 blows. Before he finished buttoning it, they pushed the body beneath a cot and covered the blood on the floor with sawdust. In the clothing sorting barrack a few meters away, non-commissioned officer Josef Wolf entered alone, lured by the same pretext, a coat reserved for him among the goods confiscated from deportees. He died the same way, within seconds, without anyone outside those 4 walls hearing it. His pistol passed from hand to hand until it reached one of the committee members, who hid it beneath his clothes for the moment when real shooting became necessary. In the shoemaking workshop, Siegfried Grecius, the German officer in command of the Ukrainian Guards, came in to try on a new pair of boots. He sat down, removed his own, and stretched out his feet with the confidence of a man who had spent months giving orders without anyone daring to meet his eyes. Yehuda Lerner, 17 years old, and Arkady Weispapier, another Soviet prisoner of war, killed him with axes before he finished putting the boots on. Minutes later, with the same axe still uncleaned, they waited for a Ukrainian guard named Klat to come looking for his superior and killed him as well. Not everything went according to plan. Rudolf Beckmann, responsible for administering the register of confiscated property, was supposed to die in an isolated warehouse, but halfway there, he changed direction and returned to his office in the administrative building. Chaim Engel, who had accidentally overheard the conspirators discussing the problem created by this change of plans, offered to solve it himself. He entered the office under some ordinary pretext and killed Beckman there, among the filing cabinets containing records of clothing and jewelry confiscated from the dead. In little more than an hour, between 11 and 12 members of the German and Ukrainian staff had been eliminated, one by one, without a single gunshot alerting the rest of the camp. Commandant Reichleitner was on leave that afternoon, together with Gustav Wagner, one of Sobibor's most feared officers, an absence the conspirators had taken into account when choosing the date. Neither the Ukrainian perimeter guards nor the remaining German staff had yet noticed that their comrades were missing. During that hour, in everything visible from outside, the camp functioned exactly as it did on any other afternoon. But the plan began to fall apart before it could be completed. Some officers who had not been lured into the workshops discovered what had happened before the planned signal was given. Peczerski climbed onto a table in the assembly area anyway and addressed the gathered prisoners. He told them what had happened. He told them to run. Some already carried rifles taken from the dead officers in the final minutes before the signal. Most carried nothing. The escape was not orderly. When it became clear that the guards at the main gate would not give way without resistance, the crowd split apart. Some ran toward the gate, others directly toward the fences, climbing over the bodies of those who had already fallen in order to gain the seconds separating life from death. The mines buried around the perimeter, laid only 4 months earlier after an initial individual escape attempt, killed several before they reached the tree line, and the successive explosions spread even greater panic among those still running. Gunfire from the watchtowers brought down others. Esther Raab, who had spent months working in the clothing sorting barrack, had put on 2 sweaters that morning, one over the other, and a new pair of boots. Not yet knowing she would have to run in them that same afternoon across a minefield. She survived. She crossed the perimeter through smoke and confusion and reached the forest, one of the few who managed it. Chaim Engel, the same man who had killed Beckman in his office, escaped that afternoon with Selma Weinberg, a young Dutch Jewish woman deported months earlier from Westerbork, with whom he had begun a relationship inside the camp. They crossed the perimeter separately, found each other again by chance in the chaos of the first minutes, and spent the rest of the war hidden in the hayloft of a Polish farmer who agreed to shelter them in exchange for money and Chaim's wristwatch. They married as soon as the region was liberated. Of the approximately 600 prisoners present in the camp that day, between 290 and 300 crossed the perimeter. More than 100 were recaptured and shot in the days immediately afterward by German and Polish units mobilized specifically for the manhunt, which searched the forests of Parshu and Włodawa with dogs and motorized patrols for almost a week. Others died in the forests of eastern Poland during the following weeks and months, betrayed by neighbors in exchange for rewards, killed by hunger, cold, or violence in a landscape that offered concealment but no safety. Some of the few who managed to contact partisan groups in the area discovered that even that option guaranteed nothing. Certain units of the Polish resistance, permeated by the same anti-Semitism that existed outside the forest, killed Jewish fugitives from Sobibór instead of accepting them. By the end of the war, only about 50 of those who escaped during the revolt were still alive, along with a small number who had escaped earlier in individual attempts. This raises the total number of people who survived after passing through Sobibór to just over 60, a figure that by itself measures how close the camp came to disappearing without leaving anyone alive to tell the story from within. Peczerski survived that same night. He crossed the Bug River with a small group of former Soviet comrades and, after spending several days hidden in the forest, joined a partisan unit operating in the Brest region. He fought with it for months, until the Red Army's advance in the spring of 1944 absorbed the partisans into regular units. It was then that the war exacted a different price from him than bullets. Like every Soviet prisoner of war who had spent years in enemy hands, he was sent to an NKVD filtration camp, where his 2 years in captivity were treated not as a misfortune, but as suspicious history. He left, not exonerated, but reassigned to a penal battalion, one of the units to which men considered of uncertain loyalty by the Soviet system were sent to die, redeeming themselves with blood. He fought with that battalion on the Baltic front and was seriously wounded in August 1944. Before that, something unexpected happened. His commander, a major named Andreev, was so moved by the account of Sobibór that he allowed Peczerski, in violation of regulations forbidding men in penal battalions from leaving their units, to travel to Moscow and testify before the Extraordinary State Commission investigating crimes committed during the German occupation. His testimony became the basis of a report titled The Uprising in Sobibór, written by Veniamin Kavarin and Pavel Antokolsky, and intended for inclusion in the Black Book, one of the earliest documentary compilations of the Holocaust. The Black Book was never published in the Soviet Union. The authorities banned it in 1947, in a political turn that already foreshadowed what would follow. In 1948, at the height of Stalin's campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans, directed against Soviet Jews suspected of Western sympathies, Pechersky was arrested along with his brother. He spent several years under accusation and was released only after Stalin's death in 1953, partly because of pressure from international voices already familiar with his story. The harassment did not end there. When several former Sobibór guards were brought to trial in West Germany during the 1960s, Soviet authorities prevented him from traveling to testify in person, and his statement had to be submitted in writing. He spent the rest of his life working as an electrician in Rostov-on-Don, writing and rewriting his memoirs for decades without securing a complete edition in his own country, and devoted much of his final years to corresponding with foreign historians and survivors who were able to tell what he was still denied permission to tell at home. He died in Rostov-on-Don on the 19th of January 1990, months before the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist, without ever receiving official Soviet recognition during his lifetime for the escape he had organized. Leon Feldhendler also survived the escape. He crossed the forests, remained in hiding until the end of the war, and returned to the Lublin region in 1944, where he found something resembling a life again. He married a survivor from Krasnostaw, a woman who, like him, had lost almost everything she had before the war. They settled in an apartment on Kowalska Street in Lublin, in a Poland already liberated from German occupation but still far from confronting its own anti-Semitism. On the 2nd of April 1945, only weeks before the German surrender, armed men broke into the apartment and shot him. He died of his wounds soon afterward. It was not an isolated case. In Poland, during those months, dozens of Jews who had survived the German occupation and returned to reclaim their homes or simply rebuild their lives were murdered by local armed groups, in a pattern of violence that continued, with varying peaks, until the Kielce pogrom 1 year later. The man who had organized from inside an extermination camp one of the most audacious acts of resistance in the history of the Holocaust did not die at the hands of an SS officer or a Troniki guard. He died in his own city, in peacetime, at the hands of neighbors. The Sobibór revolt remains the most successful prisoner uprising recorded within the Nazi camp system. It was not the first. Treblinka had experienced its own revolt 2 months earlier. But it caused the greatest operational damage to the functioning of the camp itself, and that was intolerable to Berlin, not because 300 prisoners had crossed a fence, but because they had demonstrated beyond any doubt that control inside the camps was not absolute. The response came within days. Himmler ordered the camp closed immediately. Jewish prisoners transferred from Treblinka were brought to Sobibór specifically to dismantle it, tear down the chambers, destroy the barracks, erase every recognizable structure. The work was completed by the end of October. Then, between November 1 and 10, 1,943, all those men were shot. The order left no room for interpretation. No one who had seen the foundations could be allowed to survive. No one could remain alive who might one day identify the exact place where each chamber had stood. The ground was plowed, planted with pine trees, and covered by a farm, occupied by a Ukrainian guard and his family, with instructions to maintain the appearance of an ordinary agricultural property. For almost 2 decades, that appearance worked. All 3 Action Reinhardt camps, Bełżec, Sobibór, and Treblinka, had been demolished before the war ended, unlike Auschwitz, which the Red Army found almost intact in January 1945, and which, by its physical existence alone, provided a kind of evidence Sobibór could never offer in the same way. The Nuremberg trials focused on those aspects of the Nazi regime best documented in the surviving archives. Action Reinhardt had been carried out specifically to produce the smallest possible documentary trail, which made judicial prosecution enormously difficult. Its principal architect, Odilo Globoknik, committed suicide in May 1945 before he could be tried. Many of his subordinates scattered across West Germany or South America, or disappeared under identities that were never fully verified. The first sustained legal reckoning came in the 1960s, when West German authorities, motivated in part by the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, began a systematic investigation into the surviving perpetrators of Action Reinhardt. Between 1965 and 1966, 11 former members of the SS staff at Sobibór were tried in Hagen. Karl Frenzel was sentenced to life imprisonment, although the judgment would later be reviewed through successive appeals lasting for years. Erich Bauer, the so-called gas master, also received a life sentence for his direct role in operating the chambers. Franz Stangl, who had fled to Brazil after the war with the help of escape networks connected to the church, was located by Nazi hunters, extradited in 1967, and tried in Düsseldorf, where he received a life sentence in 1970. He died of a heart attack in his cell the following year, only hours after a long conversation with journalist Gitta Sereni, in which, for the first time, he had spoken at some length about his role in the camp. Gustav Wagner, the officer whose absence from the camp that October afternoon had unknowingly been one of the factors that made the revolt easier, also fled to Brazil after the war. He was located there in 1978 and publicly recognized by a survivor who identified him on the street. But the Brazilian government rejected extradition requests from West Germany, Israel, Poland, and Austria. Wagner died in Sao Paulo in 1980, officially by suicide, without ever answering before a court for his role in the camp. Decades later, in 2011, a Munich court convicted John Demjanjuk, a former Ukrainian-born Troniki guard who had emigrated to the United States and lived there for years under an identity no court initially challenged, as an accessory to the murder of more than 28,000 people at Sobibór. The legal process leading to that conviction lasted more than 3 decades and included disputes over his exact identity and an earlier trial in Israel for crimes allegedly committed at Treblinka, which ended in acquittal because it could not be established with certainty that he was the same man. Demjanjuk died the year after his conviction, in 2012, at the age of 91, while appealing the verdict. He became one of the last men ever tried for what happened in that camp. Of the approximately 600 men, Germans and Traniki auxiliaries, who served at Sobibór during its 18 months of operation, only a handful were ever convicted by any court throughout the entire post-war period. Most of the Ukrainian guards returned after the war to Soviet territory, beyond the reach of Western justice, although some were prosecuted by Soviet courts. Most of those directly responsible for the camp's daily operation never answered before any judge. But courts, by their nature, can establish only what happened to specific individuals at specific moments. They cannot reconstruct an entire world that no longer exists physically. That required another tool, and it took even longer to arrive: archaeology. Beginning in the late 1990s, and with greater intensity during the 2000s and early 2010s, an international team of Israeli, Polish, and Dutch researchers began systematically excavating the land where the camp had stood. The surface had been altered for decades by the farm, planted trees, and the natural growth of the forest over what was supposed to have disappeared forever. But beneath that surface, the camp's infrastructure had survived. The team, led largely by Israeli archaeologist Yoram Haimi together with Polish archaeologist Wojciech Mazurek, worked between 2007 and 2014, excavating layer by layer across land that for decades had officially been regarded as little more than an ordinary post-war forest. Beneath the roots of the pines emerged the exact foundations of the gas chamber building, with its concrete walls still recognizable despite the demolition. Thousands of personal objects also appeared: keys that no longer opened any door, thimbles, toothbrushes, a wedding ring with a date engraved inside, and children's shoes whose size requires no explanation to produce its effect. Every object bore, even without a written label, the name of someone who never returned to collect it. Among the discoveries was evidence of something no German document had recorded precisely. The foundations revealed that the gas chambers had been enlarged at least once during the camp's operation, physically confirming what until then had been known only from survivor testimony about an increase in capacity during the summer of 1942. The archaeologists also documented remains of the railway track leading to the unloading platform and charred bone fragments in the pits, the result of the final stage of concealment, when in 1943 orders were given to exhume many of the bodies already buried and burn them on improvised grates made from railway rails, further reducing the physical evidence before the German retreat. The Netherlands, whose Jewish community had been disproportionately devastated by deportations to Sobibór, financed and supported much of the later archaeological and commemorative work. For many Dutch families, the connection was not abstract. For decades, their parents or grandparents had disappeared on a transport whose physical destination was not even established with certainty in the available records. In 2020, a new museum and memorial opened at the site, jointly funded by Poland, Israel, Slovakia, and the Netherlands, designed to mark the place without reconstructing it, to acknowledge what happened without turning it into scenery. At the center of the project is a memorial in the form of a descending path following the exact route of the former Himmelstrasse, allowing visitors to walk the same physical road taken by the victims to the site of the chambers, now marked and identified, rather than hidden. Beside the exposed foundations, glass display cases contain a fraction of the objects recovered in the excavations, arranged without hierarchy. A comb beside a toy, a key beside a broken eyeglass lens, each accompanied only by a label stating the exact place where it was found, because in the overwhelming majority of cases there is no way to know who owned it. The precise number of victims remains a subject of debate among historians today. The absence of complete records, a direct consequence of Action Reinhardt's deliberate policy of minimal documentation, means that estimates range from 170,000 to 250,000 murdered people. Israeli historian Yitzhak Arad, one of the first scholars to reconstruct the entire operation systematically, favored figures near the upper end of that range, based on partial railway records recovered from different European archives after the war. Dutch researcher Jules Schelvis, who was selected on the Sobibór platform itself to work in a nearby peat camp while the rest of his transport was sent directly to the chambers, preferred a more conservative estimate closer to the lower end, until new documentary evidence allowed for greater precision. That uncertainty is not a minor technical detail. It is itself the lasting effect of a concealment operation that, in certain very specific respects, worked exactly as intended. And yet it did not work completely. Every time another centimeter of earth disturbed by the shovels of 1,943 is carefully excavated, something appears that Berlin's plans failed to anticipate. A fragment of a shoe sole, a belt buckle, the edge of a comb. Tiny, silent objects that remained for 8 decades exactly where they fell, waiting beneath the roots of trees that were never supposed to be there. For decades, while the site remained almost forgotten behind the Iron Curtain, what little the Western world knew about Sobibór depended almost entirely on the trials in Hagen and Dusseldorf, and on a handful of historians who tracked down the survivors one by one. In 1982, American journalist Richard Raschke published a book based on interviews with 18 of them, which for years served as the most detailed available reconstruction of what had happened, in the absence of systematic archaeological investigation of the site itself. 5 years later, a television production based on that work brought the story of the revolt to a mass audience outside academic circles for the first time, presenting millions of viewers with an episode that until then had barely appeared in textbooks about the Second World War. The farm no longer exists. The pine trees planted to conceal the pits still stand, taller now, thicker after 8 decades of growth over ground that can no longer pretend to be an ordinary forest. Those who walk the descending memorial path today literally follow the same route taken by those who arrived on the trains. The difference is that now there is a plaque where there was once a lie, and a name engraved where there was once an unmarked pit. At some point in 1943, someone gave the order for that place to cease to exist. Not one stone was to remain upon another. Not a single man who had dug there was to remain alive. Not a single document was to mention it. They almost succeeded. To succeed completely, only one thing would have needed to happen differently. A Red Army lieutenant, stepping down from a train in September, would have had to tell the truth when asked his occupation. Instead of the lie that bought him 3 weeks of life, and with them, the possibility that someone, someday, would tell what had happened there.